Hey everyone, and welcome to the first real episode of Minecraft Disney World Q&A. Now, this is a series in which I answer all of your questions regarding pretty much anything Disney. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of play the whole series by ear. If we find that another way to format the series works better, we can always switch it later. For now, what I've done is I have picked 12 questions. I was actually really blown away. In episode 0, I asked all of you for some questions to answer, and to be 100% honest, I was sort of afraid that there wouldn't be enough for even a full episode, that there'd be like maybe 2 questions. But sure enough, there were a ton. There were at least 20 to 30. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab 12, and I'm going to answer them. And if you have a question, feel free to leave it in the comments, and I might grab it next week and talk about it and answer your question. So, first up, we have Callum Nelson, who asks, what is the most visited attraction in Walt Disney World? So this is actually a really interesting question. I actually had to do some research on this because I didn't know off the top of my head, but I had suspicions. And my suspicions were partially correct. So, there are no hard numbers. Disney has never released any sort of numbers regarding how many people ride certain rides. But there are general attractions that rank up towards the top. And believe it or not, it is believed that the most popular ride at Walt Disney World is Spaceship Earth. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, if you've ever been on it, I've done a video about the history of Spaceship Earth. It doesn't look like the sort of ride that you would pin as the most visited attraction. But I think that's where the key is in answering this question, is what is the most visited attraction? It might not be the most popular, but because it's placed right at the beginning of Epcot, right when you walk in, it's the first attraction you see. It's one that a lot of people walk onto. There's never really a long line, and the reason for that is because Spaceship Earth uses an Omnimover system, and what that is think of it, the best analogy I can think of is like the chain on a bicycle. It is a closed loop that is always moving at the same constant speed around the entire attraction. So the speed at which it's moving when you're getting on and off the ride is the same speed as while you're on it. And as a result, they never have to stop to ride. So people are always getting off, people are always getting on. And when you have that sort of dynamic going, what you end up with is a ride that can put a lot of people through it within an hour. And so you'll see, I think, rides that use the Omnimover system. The Haunted Mansion is another example. I think these are those sort of rides that will be the most visited because you have this constant stream. You know, when you look at Space Mountain, it's loading 3 people at a time or 6 people at a time per car. And so the line doesn't move very quickly, and then it grows, and then you see a long line and you might be not as inclined to get on it, as opposed to Spaceship Earth where there's almost never a line, and even if there is, it's always moving because the ride's always moving. So, not officially an answer by any stretch, but it appears Spaceship Earth might be the most visited attraction in Walt Disney World. Next up, we have subscriber CVS Pad, who says, I noticed that there's a picture of Walt Disney World train passing over a bridge in 1972, I think, and it's a field there instead of a forest. How did they go from a field to all of those rides, including why they picked Big Thunder Mountain over the Matterhorn? So, to sort of answer your first question as to how, you have to keep in mind that Walt Disney World, up until the point of when it was created, was the largest private construction project in the country's history. It really was the efforts of a small army to build this place, and partially it was, you know, sort of stubbornly sticking to the opening date and having to get it done. And it was partially just sort of knowing what success would be behind it, or at least the perception of the known success behind it. Because you have to see, you know, Disneyland was wildly successful, and there was a lot of hype around Disney World when it was finally announced. So it was a lot of work. There was a lot of earth moving involved in the project, especially if you think about something like the Seven Seas Lagoon, which is the big body of water between all of the main hotels and the Magic Kingdom and the Ticket and Transportation Center. That was actually almost a swamp, essentially, when they found it. And so what they ended up doing when they built this thing is they drained the entire lagoon of all its water. they got a whole bunch of earth movers in there, and they cleaned all the muck out of the bottom of this basin. They replaced it with white sand and then refilled it up. Now, if you've ever been there in person, you know the size of this body of water we're talking about, but it is massive, and it just sort of, I think, is the best highlight of how much work went into that. As for why they didn't put the Matterhorn or why they put Big Thunder Mountain, you know, Disney was a big supporter of doing things differently or new. You know, he had this saying, you don't follow pigs with pigs, which went back to the Three Little Pigs cartoon, which is wildly successful. And they asked him when the sequel would come out, and he said, you don't follow pigs with pigs. And while Walt certainly wasn't around for the construction of Walt Disney World, you know, there's certainly, you know, the idea that his influence did play a part. In fact, Roy was building it because of his brother. There was talk after Walt's death of not building anything, of just selling the land, because they had a ton of land in Florida and just being on their way. But, you know, Roy made it his sort of personal mission until it was open to build this park. And there are, you know, reasons for attractions being moved over and others not. I mean, you do want it to be slightly different. I think location also plays a big part of it. For instance, you know, Pirates of the Caribbean was never put in Walt Disney World initially because they thought it was too close to the real Caribbean. But because it was super popular, they put it over there. But I don't think it was a situation in which the Matterhorn was rejected and then in its place it was Big Thunder Mountain. I think those were two separate occasions. We have 132 Maurizio who asks, I'm curious if a Jungle Book themed ride really exists. So I had to do a little research on this one too, because this caught my attention and I didn't know off the top of my head. So from what I can tell, there is no Jungle Book themed ride in Walt Disney. There's none in Walt Disney World, I can tell you that much. I don't know about any of the other Disneys. There doesn't seem to be. What you might be thinking of is the Jungle Cruise, which has, I think, aesthetics that are very similar. Aesthetics that are very similar. Although that ride was more based on both Walt Disney's nature documentaries as well as like The African Queen with Humphrey Bogart. Now, there's no solid source for this, but in my research, I found that apparently there was a Jungle Book adventure audio animatronic show that was planned for Tokyo Disney, but it ended up never being built. So it seems like that might have been the closest you would ever come to seeing a Jungle Book themed ride. It is interesting to note that they never integrated the Jungle Book into the Jungle Cruise. You would have almost thought that they could have done that pretty easily. But I guess back then, the idea of synergy wasn't as strong as it is today. The Davestrism asks, are the lines long in November? So that's a great question. And the answer is yes and no. It really depends on when you go. Disney is known for having its popular seasons. It's also known for having its off seasons. They're both very different, and they both can change very rapidly. So in November, you have Thanksgiving here in the United States, and that is a big holiday, and that's a big holiday for Disney. So you can almost bet when you're going around the time of Thanksgiving that you're going to see a lot of long lines. However, other parts of the month, it could be really empty. Personally, I've gone at times where my trip sort of straddled the line between being off season and being holiday season, particularly I want to say it was Memorial Day, right before the summer started, and within a matter of days it went from being an almost empty sort of resort to being packed, because it was just that perfect moment where everyone was going on vacation and getting out of school and things like that. So it really depends. Now, the cool thing is there are so many fans, you know, of Disney World that there are a lot of resources online where you can find this stuff out. Touring plans, more or less. If you Google it, I don't have any specific ones off the top of my head that I'm ready to endorse, but there are websites that do have what they call crowd calendars, and they sort of give you a gauge using historical data based on previous years of how many people you could expect to see at the park at any given day. And it's actually quite impressive how much work goes into getting that number. It's not a wild guess or a vague guess, but they try to pin it down to, like, you know, almost like an attendance number guess. So this question came from two different people. They're very similar. So both Mr. RCC45 and Melly Online asked, what's my favorite story on Disney World, or controversies, how it was made, stuff like that. So there is a book called Reality Land that I highly suggest. I want to say it was written by David Koenig. I don't know the spelling off the top of my head, but if you were to Google Reality Land Disney, you'll probably find it. It's a book telling the history of the creation of Walt Disney World, starting from when Walt was looking at land to basically today with Michael Eisner opening the Animal Kingdom. Although it's sort of anti-Eisner, the book has a great look into the construction of the parks, and there's some cool little stories there. I think the two that stick out to me most are sort of the operation that went into acquiring the land required to build Disney World. You see, Walt at that point was famous. He was Walt Disney, of the Disney Company. And as a result, any land that he would have tried to buy himself in Florida would have been extremely expensive, because the sellers would know this is Disney. If Bill Gates came to you tomorrow and wanted to buy your house, you know how much money he's got. So you're, of course, going to ask differently than if it's just a random stranger. So they put a lot of work into keeping it secret. They had fake companies set up that were buying up all this land, multiple ones, so it didn't look like there was one buyer. I mean, they went to such extreme lengths that the people who were buying this land, and we're not even talking about famous people like Walter Roy, we're just talking about the people who worked within Disney and within these fake companies, were flying to multiple cities to throw off any sort of trail, so nobody saw this direct connection between California and Florida, or New York and Florida. They would bounce around just to throw off reporters' trails, and I think that was really interesting. A lot of people compared it to espionage, and that is really what it sounded like from what I've read, is that they had to keep this thing a secret, because once the cat was out of the bag, the price of the remaining land that they had to buy went up a lot. The other story that I think was really cool, and this isn't a story so much as a moment, is they were building the Contemporary, which is the A-framed hotel in which the monorail goes through, and they were doing a test ride at night. And they retell the story. I forget who was on the test ride. I think Walt Roy was involved at this point, of this monorail going into the Contemporary, which at the point was still under construction. They were constructing into the night because, again, they were really stuck on this opening day. And the way the writer describes it is, this futuristic, train of the future rolling into this hotel with sparks flying from all the construction workers, and how seeing this thing roll in turned everybody's heads, and it gave them this moment of realizing what they were all working towards. And I think that's just a great cinematic moment, that if there ever was a movie about the creation of Disney World, you would see that scene in the movie, just because I can imagine, you're a construction guy, and at that point, it's the late 60s, I believe. You're just a construction guy building a hotel. It's no different. But when you see this monorail roll in, which today has futuristic aesthetics, so just imagine like 30, 40 years ago, must have really been like an eye-opener. Okay, so we have Kitty and Xander 025, who says, "Hey Rob, I'm going to Disney in 8 days, and I'm not a roller coaster fan, but I will ride Big Thunder. So do you have any suggestions for rides? Thank you." So, you're in luck. Disney World is founded on the principle that this is a park for all members of the family, which means if you're not a fan of roller coasters, you're in luck, because there are plenty of rides to go on. Now, I'm not going to suggest specific ones. I will say this much. There's Big Thunder Mountain, there's Splash Mountain, there's Space Mountain, there's Rock and Roller Coaster, am I even remembering it? Am I missing any? And Everest and the Animal Kingdom. I mean, there's like 5 or 6 roller coasters. So honestly, beyond those, you could go on pretty much anything. Now, there are some thrill rides like Dinosaur, which aren't roller coasters per se, but they are extremely shaky and extreme. And so if that's the sort of thing you don't like, you might want to avoid rides like that. But most of the time, they'll give you fair warning if you have if you're getting onto a thrill ride. So if that's the sort of thing to stray away from, you'll know well ahead of time and you won't accidentally walk onto them. And then at that point, I'd suggest everything. I mean, honestly, if we all had enough time to go on every attraction at Disney World, I think it would be worth doing, because I don't think there is a ride there. I think there are rides that don't meet their full potential, but I don't think there's a ride that is ever unenjoyable to go on. All right, and so finally, what I'm going to do now is there are also a lot of questions here that I guess are personal. They're just about my opinion. I'm going to shoot through those faster than normal because I guess they don't need as much explanation. So Connor Duffy asks, what is my favorite restaurant? My favorite restaurant is the Sci-Fi Drive-In in Hollywood Studios. The way I look at food is, I mean, and this is sort of personal to me, I live in New York City. The best food of any kind is here. I can find the best of almost anything here. So like when I go to Disney, I'm not doing this for the food quality. I don't need an amazing meal. What I go to Disney for is the setting. And for me, sci-fi, old bad sci-fi movies, a drive-in theater, I love all of that. That 50s Americana or Norman Rockwell thing totally grabs me. So that's my favorite place to eat. The Milkman 821 says, where do you stay when you go to Disney and why do you stay there? The short answer is I don't go to one specific place. I try to mix it up. I think Disney has a lot of fantastic themed resorts, and so I try to go to different ones each time. I've stayed at the All-Stars. I've stayed at Port Orleans. I've stayed at the Contemporary, Coronado, a bunch of them. And, you know, whenever I plan a trip, which isn't like very often, I'm not, you know, I don't go every year, maybe every other year if I'm lucky. I try to look at different places and consider them. You know, just a short, for instance, when I went with my friends a year ago, we stayed at the cabins at the Fort Wilderness Campgrounds. And when I booked it, to be 100% honest, I wasn't happy. Like, I was outvoted by the group. I didn't want to stay there. I don't like nature very much. But I went because the group picked it, and I knew at the end of the day, it's Disney. I'm going to enjoy it either way. And you know what? I ended up enjoying that resort a lot. Like, if I ever go on an extended trip again, like a 10-day trip, I'll probably stay there because it's really relaxing. Sora 1888 asks, what ride in past Disney World history would you want to bring back the most? My answer is I do not want to bring any ride back. I think the whole premise of the theme parks, Walt's dream was to make an area that was always changing and improving and evolving. And so if a ride is closed down for whatever reason and something else is put in its place, it's for a good reason. And it's for the better of the park and to keep it fresh. So I would never bring anything back. What I would say is I would love to see an attraction that harnesses the spirit of Horizons, which is an attraction that focuses on the potential of where we could be living in the future and what life could be like and how much we should strive for that. And it doesn't have to be Horizons or Horizons 2.0. And the Spaceship Earth kind of does it a little bit towards the end when you do that interactive screen thing. But I want to see like a true ride that sort of shows us like what life could really be like in 50 years. I think that would be fun. Mr. D23 Disney asks, do I like New Fantasyland or do I miss Toontown? I can't really answer that. I've never been to New Fantasyland. I haven't been there since it's opened. I'm excited to check it out. I do miss Toontown a little bit. I think it's interesting because Toontown initially started as Mickey's Birthday Circus, which was like a temporary attraction that Eisner put up for Mickey's birthday, and it just sort of stuck around. But I'm excited to check out New Fantasyland. And then we have Sarah Cormican, who asks, who's your favorite character? Goofy. That's simple. I don't know. I like Goofy. I love the old. If you haven't seen them, I suggest you look up the old Goofy cartoons from like the 50s and 60s that were like mock instructional videos. I think they're probably among the best Disney cartoons. And then last but not least, Rufus Studios asks, what do I think of Hidden Mickeys? I think they're awesome. I actually wasn't going to answer that initially because that's all I have to say about them. I will say if you don't know what a Hidden Mickey is, the Imagineers have this tendency of hiding the Mickey ears, you know, the big circle with the 2 ears on the top, throughout the theme parks, just like in more places than you can ever imagine. And it makes for a fun little game of looking for them, or you could grab a book and track down all the hidden Mickeys you want to find. It's just like one of those additions that make you realize that Walt Disney World stands above and beyond, you know, your Six Flags or your Busch Gardens or your run-of-the-mill amusement park. There's just so much depth to it that I imagine 90% of the people who go to Disney World are completely unaware of the existence of hidden Mickeys, but there they are. If you do a quick Google search, I'm sure you'll find websites dedicated to finding them and pointing them out. In any case, this has been the very first episode of Disney Q&A. Again, I want to thank you if you've submitted a question. If you've submitted one that hasn't been picked, feel free to submit another one or to try again. I do try and keep these all in a list, and I'm trying to keep them, in bite-sized pieces so that, we don't have an hour-long video every week. Again, I'm up for answering any question Disney related, whether you're going to the parks and you need advice, or you want to know about the history of the parks, or anything about the company or Walter, things like that. Feel free to ask. I hope you have a fantastic week. Whatever you're doing, make the most of it. And I hope to see you all here next week for the next episode of Minecraft Disney's Q&A. Bye, everyone.